with AMIC. So the topic for today is technology, something that I think we thought ran our lives before, but we just had to wait until we were all in lockdown to find out just how dependent we were on it and just how many apps there were for video conferencing. So first, some housekeeping. As our virtual symposiums are interactive, you have an opportunity to submit questions and to vote in some polls. So to do this, you just need to go to the website slido.com and enter the code CaptiveVirtual when prompted. So now to just go through our agenda for today. So we'll have a quick welcome from myself, which is happening now, and then my co-host, the Technical Director of AMIC, Julia Graham, who I'm sure many of you know. Julia is just going to have a conversation then with Captive owner Heather McClure about utilising the full potential of your cybersecurity program. We'll have a quick break and then we'll go to our panel of the day, which is focused on strengthening risk management with data and AI. And now I'm very pleased to introduce Julia Graham. So thank you, Julia.
Thank you very much indeed for that introduction, and welcome to this discussion. As Lauren says, part of the virtual symposiums, and today we're going to be focusing on the subject of technology. As Lauren said, I'm Julia Graham. I'm the Deputy CEO and Technical Director at AMIC, the Association for UK-based risk professionals. My background is 30-something plus years in insurance and 11 years working as the Chief Risk Officer for a global law firm. I then supposedly retired and then ended up working in the most wonderful role at AMIC, networking with people like yourselves online today, and Heather, who I'm going to talk to in a moment. I'm also actually a non-exec director on 4 captives, all domiciled here in Guernsey. So welcome. Now that's quite enough about me. I'm here really to introduce our main speaker today and to welcome Heather McClure. Heather is the Chief Risk Officer at OU Medicine, the academic physician and hospital practice associated with the University of Oklahoma. The OU Medicine organisation includes several large adult and children's teaching hospitals, a medical practice of over 2,000 individual providers, and approximately 12,000 total employees. Heather is a lawyer and directs the risk management, insurance and claims management functions of the system, including the cyber liability programme. So Heather, welcome. I understand that what you're now going to do is going to take some time to go through a few slides which focus on cyber liability risk management. And once you've had the opportunity to do that, Heather, then we'll be talking about a few questions as our time permits. So we'll be getting those questions from conversations that we've had beforehand, but also from those of you who are online today and are feeding your questions in as per Lauren's advice. So Heather, without further ado, the stage is yours.
Thank you so much, Julia. I really appreciate the invitation. It's, of course, been a very busy time for all of us, particularly in healthcare and for our system. And it actually is very nice to take a break from that and speak to colleagues such as yourself and all of those who are listening on the line about cyber liability, which is a very important coverage and risk management function of our system. I was asked to put just a few slides together to describe our program, so I'll take a little, just 10 or 15 minutes to go through a few slides. I think, Katie, if you could advance to the first slide, I'll just describe our risk management functions related to cyber. So, cyber, of course, is one of our biggest spends in terms of premium dollars. So our system takes it very seriously, not just operationally, but because the events that could occur to damage our system, and for first-party liability and third-party liability are pretty severe. So we partner with a number of consultants, certainly with our broker, our insurance broker, and the specialist team that they have in doing cyber risk assessments. Certainly when we began talking about taking out commercial cyber liability, it's probably been 7 or 8 years ago. We decided that we would take some of that on in our captive. So we have some portions of our program under our captive, and some that we purchase, a lot that we purchase externally. But we, in filling out those sort of market applications, as many of you know, that in and of itself is sort of a risk assessment, because it causes you to go back and ask your IT security people questions, and to get answers to the market's questions about risk. And so that's certainly an important assessment. But beyond that, we do at least an annual risk assessment using some standard questionnaires and things that the market produces. We have a cyber advisory committee, so separate from our captive board or our hospital board. We have a cyber advisory committee made up of not just the leadership of IT security, but we have our compliance and ethics officers, our, of course, chief risk officer, and other leadership from risk. We have our HIPAA privacy officer and others who need to be looking at things like business associate agreements with outside vendors who need access to our network for operational reasons. That committee looks at all cyber and privacy liability or privacy policies, discusses relationships to technology vendors, and then also looks at our coverages and makes sure that the risks that we see within our system are defined in the coverages and that we have adequate limits. We have started doing annual tabletop exercises. We actually had one planned for early May that had to be canceled, and many of you know that's when either a consultant group or a carrier can sponsor sort of a mock attack on the system or ransomware, something to cause a business interruption related to cybersecurity, and really helps us script out what we would do if that event were really happening. Who would we need to involve from the system? Who would be making decisions? How would we sort of have an incident command center set up quickly to deal with whatever liability occurred? We can advance to the next slide. So I'm certainly happy to answer questions about any of that when we get to the question portion of the presentation. But briefly, I won't read all of this. I wanted to give you some material about our first party and third party coverages under our cyber program. One very important aspect of our program is breach response. And so it's important to our system, as it would be in any industry, to be able to notify those affected individuals. And in our case, it's usually patients in our healthcare system, that their information was breached. And unfortunately, we have had a few times where we have had to do this. And so sometimes we're talking a limited number of folks, and sometimes we're talking many thousands people whose information, maybe by way of the medical records, or maybe by another transmittal of medical record numbers or social security numbers, those kinds of things could have been breached. And so any cyber liability policy, or any that I've seen, would focus heavily on breach response. And so with that breach response, not only do we have coverage for our costs to respond to the incident, but we have access to a panel of experts, legal teams, forensics, and others that the carrier has put together, who are on call 24/7. There's an 800 number that we call in the middle of the night if we need to. And then we're immediately connected to those who can help guide us through that event. And that was really comforting to me as a chief risk officer, because this isn't, of course, the only line that I place. I have 18 other insurance lines, and I don't consider myself a cyber expert in any way. It's nice to have access to those individuals on the breach response team of the carrier to help us. And in this case, it's a reinsurer. So we have the general first party coverage. Parts of our coverage are listed in the first 4 bullets of that middle section: network and dependent business interruption, and then system failure and dependent system failure. Obviously, the dependent business interruption and system failure have to do with those of our vendors or a business on which we rely. And then the digital asset protection would be if we needed to restore corrupted or files or software after a breach, then the coverage responds to that. Cyber extortion, thankfully, I haven't had experience with that at my current system. So, but we're definitely seeing a lot of that in healthcare and in other industries. And so we want to be prepared for that when it occurs. And in this coverage, the carrier actually sort of takes over the negotiation, sort of hostage negotiation type with the extorters, can pay them in Bitcoin or whatever currency they're demanding to release our data as we need it. We've heard in healthcare, we know of reports of other systems where medical records and other important records were locked down by hackers demanding ransom for their release. And it would be important to us to be able to continue our business for that ransom to be paid. And so unfortunately, this is a very necessary coverage. Katie, you can go on to the next slide. Third-party coverages would be important for, obviously, for third parties who would be affected by a breach in our system. So security and privacy liability, damages to others for our breaches. PCI data security has to do with the banking security for, taking credit cards, et cetera, and if that had been breached. And then we have regulatory liability coverage for Office of Civil Rights fines. So for example, if we did have a breach of patient records and the OCR fined us $100,000 or whatever, then we have coverage for that. And again, media liability coverage is important too for third-party coverage. You can go on to the next slide, Katie. Some of the newer coverages that we've taken on recently that are important. Some of these are sub-limited, so they're not all at the highest coverage of, say a normal breach, but they are important coverages. So we have some reputational harm coverage. We have voluntary shutdown coverage, which has to do with there's a breach in a certain portion of our data and it shuts down our system, but then another part of our system we are concerned about, and it's operating okay, but we voluntarily shut that part down. So there's a little overlap here with a network business interruption coverage that would be a first party coverage, but this is sort of an extension or an expansion of that coverage. Bricking coverage would be, so for example, it's sort of a property damage portion of the policy. So let's say there was ransomware and the laptops weren't actually damaged on the outside, but we know internally the software was, and we needed to replace laptops or computers that had been affected, and so that coverage would apply there. Invoice manipulation overlaps a little bit on crime policies. So we get an invoice that we think is legitimate, we pay it, but then a vendor is hacked, they didn't get our payment, it's misrouted somewhere. It's a little bit of a type of a social engineering coverage, but we have that as on our cyber as well. And then contingent bodily injury or property damage would be if, let's say, a patient was in our system and our PCA pumps in our hospital were hacked. The computer system that runs those were hacked, and someone received more medication out of than they should have, or there was some type of something went awry with their equipment because of a hack. This coverage would probably overlap a little bit with our a lot with our professional liability policy, but it would add some coverage there too. So Julia, I have another slide on current challenges. Katie, you could go to that next slide, and then briefly, I wanted to mention to you, obviously, that with our preparation for COVID-19, we certainly have a lot of new challenges that do impact our cyber program. We have our security team now refocused on pandemic planning and getting new people on the network. We've got workforce members who are either ill, and so we've got less of a workforce than we did before, or they are brand new because we're taking in contracted healthcare providers and other administrators that are new to our system to help us deal with COVID. So there's a lot of effect there. And that's the last slide I have.
Well, I think that was a fascinating insight there, Heather, and you've covered some really topical ground on technology-related issues. So I'm going to come back in, if I may, and just talk through with you. If we can keep that current challenges slide on the screen, because I think that's a great driver for some of the questions that have been coming in. And I'm going to pick up the issue, I think, to start with, that's come in about, I was reading in the tech press today that there's a belief that there will be some permanent changes to technology storage, technology itself, and business continuity planning as more organisations encourage more remote working. So this is not considered by many organisations as a passing change, but probably going to affect many organisations permanently in terms of the way they work. And I guess what that starts to introduce, Heather, is on the privacy front, some issues which are probably surfacing because more people are accessing the data off-site. Is that something that that you've been looking at OU? And if so, do you have any sort of thoughts that you can share with us about some of your observations on that subject?
Absolutely. So, working from home in a healthcare system until now, at least in our system, was not common. From obviously providers need to be on site. Now we were experienced in limited areas related to, let's say, physicians accessing radiology or other testing from their home devices, right? So they could keep track of their patients. And so we had some applications that allowed them to do that from home in the middle of the night if they needed to, or anytime during the day. And they could access the medical record from home. But actually working from home on a permanent basis or semi-permanent basis is not something that we were really practiced in or familiar with. So we, over the course of a week or 10 days, when our system made the decision that even essential personnel would be able to telecommute from home for the near future, we did not have a lot of policies around that. We had some policies related to access of data, making sure that you were protecting data when you were home, not taking, for example, protected health information home unless there was a real need to do so. And if you did do that, you needed to be sure and bring it back to the office, destroy it, shred it, whatever. But now we have virtually everyone in administration is working at least part-time from home, many people full-time from home now. And, we haven't had the kind of training for everyone because it was it was done so quickly. And so we are kind of backtracking now, and policies are being written this week and last week and the week before on how to safeguard information at home. Not everybody has a defined home office. Some people are working from their bedrooms or their kitchen tables, and other people are coming in and out of their home, obviously, and screens are up that have private information on them from other patients. And so it presents a lot of challenges. We're working through those, and we're having meetings. Our cyber advisory committee is still meeting and working on pushing that content out. And luckily the markets responded as well. People like you and others are, other experts are advising us. And so we're able to take expert advice and also push that out in our policies.
On the subject of COVID-19 related issues, do you see, I'm wondering how you manage the compounding effect of what's happening with COVID in a market that was already a hard market with, in some cases, challenges to get cover at a price that's affordable and appropriate to pay. I mean, do you have an observation about what the effect of COVID-19 overlaying the hard market it might be having on your business, and particularly in the space of technology and cyber that we're talking about here?
Sure, it's definitely on our minds. As you've said, it was already a hardening market, and now that this has hit or the hard market has hit at really the worst time for us, because we're already suffering the financial issues that we have surrounding the pandemic. Our government is talking about, helping the health systems out, and other industries out, but we're just not sure what to expect or how much or when. In the meantime, we need to renew our insurance program. Our policy starts again July 1st. So this spring, we're in our annual renewal. We're really looking, Julia, for value in every dollar of premium that we're paying. And so we're looking at ways that our captive can stand in the gap and take on reasonable coverages, not just in cyber, but on other lines as well. Maybe buy down deductibles on certain lines. Cyber is certainly one of them. Maybe looking at higher attachment rates so that the policy wouldn't trigger payment until higher up damages. But those are kinds of things we need to be creative about. The captive allows us, thankfully, to do that. And certainly our brokers are experts who can help us do those feasibility studies, can help us determine what kind of risk we can take on as a system, and where our biggest bang for the buck is. I know that I've had recent conversations with my broker, my cyber broker, about each of the sublimits, each of the coverages. Do I need them or not need them? If it's costing me extra premium dollar and it's a throwaway coverage that I don't really need, can I get a break on? I mean, I'm sort of nickeling and diming the coverages because we need to save dollars where we can. Does that answer your question? Yeah,
it does. And I've got a couple of questions. I'm just sort of trying to sort of phrase them together, but I think simplistically, they sort of come together under the subject of governance. You mentioned that you have an advisory group as part of your governance that looks at cyber. How do you think in the current world that we're living and working in, Heather, that the whole approach to governance is going to change? I'm sort of thinking here in the ultimate scope of diversity, and I don't mean just gender, but what do you think the shape of the modern board is going to look like in the future to be able to govern the really extensive type of captive, particularly that you've got at OU? Do you have any thoughts that you could share with us on what you feel governance demands and needs might look like in the future?
Sure. So I would say the days that, being appointed to a captive board or any governance board related to cyber or any one of our main operations, at least in our industry, as a figurehead is gone. We're no longer just having sort of rubber stamp boards that exist really just for informational purposes, just boards that we report to, that management reports to. We really need to have a multidisciplinary, diverse board who can really wrestle with tough decisions on allocation of resources. I think that's, something that someone really needs to be able to do if they're going to be able to govern well, because there are limited resources now, and we need to understand where to deploy them and where we can't. And like, referring to the discussion earlier, in really getting value for every dollar paid. We don't have the luxury, not that we ever really did, but we certainly don't now. We don't have the luxury of just paying for anything.
Thank you. And as part of that governance responsibility, Heather, and I think this might have to be our last question. So I'm thinking you've got on your final slide, the security team is refocused on pandemic planning. And it does seem to me, from a lot of the reading I do and people I'm talking to, that despite the fact that pandemic has never been really for years off the World Economic Forum Global Risk Report list, it might be quite low down in terms of potential impact, and probably not there at all on the list of risks that people think might actually happen, but it's been there. This pandemic seems to have caught organisations by surprise. Do you think going forward that it's going to get a higher level of attention? And do you think organisations are going to change the way they go about designing and running their pandemic planning? Do you sort of have any view about how you might change for the future in your business when you start to look at this subject for the future, particularly on the technology side of things, bearing in mind that life probably is not going to be quite the same. Again, there won't be a return to business as usual. It'll be something new. We don't just know what yet. But do you see a change in focus on planning so we don't get caught out next time, or will we go back to where we were before?
Oh, I hope we don't go back to where we were before. I don't see how we could now. I think we got a sort of a foreshadowing of this, at least in my area of the country with Ebola. We had a little bit of that. It wasn't a pandemic, but we had this communicable disease issue that hit some hospital systems that had to react very quickly a couple years ago. However, I think you're right. None of us predicted this kind of pandemic. I know that I have looked at all my insurance policies to see which ones exclude or include communicable diseases. So some property policies, pollution policies, others in addition to cyber would come into play in a pandemic. So on the insurance side, I think we're going to be very focused on what's going to be covered and not covered in the future. With regard to technology, I think we're all sort of learning on the job, and I think this is really, unfortunately, great training for the next pandemic. And I hate to say that, but I think we have to admit that something like this could happen in the future, in the near future or in the distant future, and we need to take what we've learned here and move forward and put in solid technology plans to deal with it in the future.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much indeed for that, Heather. I think we could probably sit there and have our fireside chat. It's sometimes easy to forget that we're separated by so many miles. I've really enjoyed discussing these issues with you, Heather. And before we just close, we ran a poll as we started, and we asked the people online today whether or not they put cyber in their captive. And the conclusion of that is we have 30% said no, but they're thinking about it. 10% said no, we're not going to do it. And 60%, interestingly, particularly for our colleagues from Captive Reviewers, 60% are not captive owners. I wonder how many, if our hard market continues in the way that it has done, and the challenges of COVID-19 seem to continue for the insurance industry in being able to deal with it as well, how high that percentage will be if we ran that poll this time next year. And why don't people put this in their captive? Well, it's just not implemented yet. It's too difficult, and they're happy with what they've got. Well, I'm really pleased for those who are happy with what they've got, but again, I'd like to come back in 12 months' time and ask those who are not captive owners and those who are happy with their current coverage whether they still feel the same way. So on those words, Heather, I'd like to thank you once again for being with us here today in this virtual symposium. I'd like to thank very much our colleagues from Pageant Media and Captive Review for making today possible. It's been great to see so many of you online. We've had a great turnout, and therefore, of course, I'd like to close by thanking everybody who's taken the time and trouble to dial in today and to share Heather's thoughts with you. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Julia and Heather. That was really, really fascinating. And now we have an equally fascinating panel, which I'm very excited about as well. So our second panel of the day is on strengthening risk management with data and AI. And we have two great experts who I think are going to speak about some really fascinating things. So we have Chris Holland, who is a professor of information management at Loughborough University. And we have Julie Bordeaux, who is a president of and general manager at PCH Mutual Insurance Co. RRG. So welcome, Julie and Chris, to the panel.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah. So I'm going to be moderating today, which I'm very excited about. So a lot of captive owners and those in the captive space seem hesitant to get involved with data and AI. So Julie, what was it that first got you engaged with this?
Yes, thank you so much, Lauren. I greatly appreciate the opportunity to talk to everybody today, and we'll certainly take note that the majority of the audience are not captive owners, but may be people who can bring these kind of opportunities to whomever they serve in the industry. So what really got PCH, which is a company that insures a little over 1,700 personal care home and assisted living facilities in the long-term care space in about 47 states in the US, involved with this opportunity was that it was indeed a great opportunity, one that was low cost and with really exponential positive impact. These opportunities presented the potential to solve very big problems in our industry, which I'll tell you more about during the course of this session, in innovative ways, and in innovative ways that we actually partner in creating those solutions. So not only do they serve our company and our members directly, but that we might be the actual training ground and fertile ground for those solutions was very attractive to PCH. Chris, I know you have some thoughts on this as well.
Yes, certainly, yes. So my name's Chris Holland from Loughborough University. I'm logged into the Slido and I would welcome any questions. I always say that at the start of a lecture, so I don't see why this shouldn't apply online too. I'm involved in a research project that's sponsored by UKRI, which is a branch of the UK government, looking at the application of artificial intelligence and related digital technologies in insurance. And we're particularly interested in how technology and business models influence and are influenced by each other, and looking at the factors that can facilitate the uptake and implementation of these technologies. I've worked at the interface of business and technology now for over 30 years, and it's my view that most significant business transformations now use digital technologies in some way, shape or form, and insurance is no exception here. And I think there are some really exciting developments occurring, and I think there are also some serious implementation issues for adopting and implementing this technology.
Yeah, great. And I think a lot of the time when people hear these words like, you know, artificial intelligence and insurtech, they don't have a full understanding of what it means, which can perhaps sometimes scare people off, and is why people aren't as engaged. So, Chris, if you want to start and maybe explain a little bit about your definition of some of these concepts, which might help people who are a bit, I guess, not afraid, but a little bit maybe intimidated, or maybe why they don't get, you know, involved as much.
Sure, yeah. So if you think about management information systems, so things like customer relationship management, enterprise systems, supply chain management, decision support systems, most managers will have had experience of implementing those, what I would term transactional systems. And these are focused very much on processes. They cover the whole of the organization, or they help separate organizational entities link to each other, for example, in supply chain management systems. The crucial point about these systems is that the algorithms that make them tick, the algorithms behind a production management system or a CRM, tend to be static algorithms, i.e. they don't change over time. So in production management, this is called materials requirements planning. That algorithm's been around for a long time. It's evolved, but it doesn't change in a dynamic fashion within an implementation. What's different about artificial intelligence is that the algorithms are adaptive in the light of new information. So if you look at, for example, implementations within insurance, such as robotic process automation or image recognition, for example, in claims management, automated image recognition that Ping An has implemented in China, or chatbots. These systems evolve and learn, so to speak, over time in the light of data and training. And that's what makes artificial intelligence so different to historical management information systems.
So, Lauren, I'd like to weigh in on that as well with kind of a practical example based on PCH's experience. We're currently engaged in 2 InsurTech partnerships, and they both involve an artificial intelligence component in terms of the long-term plan of the startup. And when I got into this, I actually am a mentor at a tech incubator in Chicago, and the CEO of that incubator has a great saying, which is, will always be a competitive advantage to being a human, but what artificial intelligence and the kind of technology that we're promising for our future does is enable people to do the work that they really want to do and have computers do the rest of the work. But getting down to what our partnerships potentially will yield for us, one of the companies we're working with is called Care Validate, and they have a sensor system along with a software platform that can be used in an application on a smartphone to monitor our member insured's residents. So we have, as you can imagine, vulnerable adult residents in our residential care facilities. And the adverse outcomes obviously have to do with things like them falling, or having situations where our caregivers can't always be there. So the sensor system monitors different biometric data, not using recording or advices that can be considered invasive in any way. And that aggregates data that is actually provided to the caregivers to enable them to give better and more responsive care. Now, if you can imagine over the course of a period of time where that kind of data is being aggregated on behalf of many residents around the world who would potentially be using a system like that, that system actually promises, hopefully in the future, to be able to predict an adverse outcome before it happens. So the example would be that a resident's biometric data reading at night that the resident was restless, their heart rate was elevated, so there were some indicators that the resident was not sleeping, and the alert to the caregiver would be, Mrs. Smith is 3 minutes away from falling, based on the information we're getting. So that kind of prediction, as you can imagine, has an amazing effect on the folks who are serving that resident, as well as the folks who are insuring that resident, in terms of what could ultimately be avoiding a claim. So those kind of things are what these kind of engagements portend, that are absolutely something that we cannot ignore and want to fully be engaged in. Back to you, Lauren.
Yeah, well, that's absolutely fascinating. I didn't realize that you could do that much, like to that level of detail. And so I guess, like, what should risk managers consider when they are looking to take on an InsurTech partner, and when they're first diving into this kind of data and AI universe? Julie, like, what would be your advice for risk managers?
Well, I think anybody who is going to get involved in an InsurTech partnership has to do some level of due diligence. So you're going to look at, evaluating the problem that the InsurTech company seeks to solve, and the likelihood of the success, of that startup. As we all know, we're all in the risk business, and so we know that tech startups have a really lousy success rate. It's about a 90% failure rate. So you have to create some internal metrics to look at to try to determine what kind of success may be down the road. So we looked at the knowledge and experience of the founders. We, obviously got their references and did searches and things like that, independent, to figure out what their track record was. And a couple of the founders actually had long track records and other successes. In the case of our other partner, this was kind of a first endeavor. So then you're looking at, do they have any affiliations with like tech incubators or accelerators? Because those can lead to a boost in the odds of their success. They have a whole support system underpinning them, and those programs are always designed to lead them to investors. So if the engagement, if they don't have any seed money or investment prospects initially, that might be a downside. But if they have been admitted into an accelerator, an incubator, those kind of things are obviously on the positive side in terms of due diligence. Additionally, the overriding question is, will the monetary investment, which generally is very low, and our sweat equity yield something of value to our member insured. So, that's a really important metric with regard to that. But I also think you have to consider the fact that this is a partnership, so there's mutuality. And what I think also might deter some captives who are really the most poised for this kind of engagement to build these kind of solutions. But captives might think they don't have assets to give that's not monetary, right? And we're all concerned about the bottom line. But captives do have assets. For tech startups, data is gold. Data, and the data that you have historically and our historical data on our claims was gold to our captive partners. Also, most folks involved in this industry have a vast network of people they can connect their captive partners to. AI Insurance, which is our other InsurTech partner, actually credits me with their next 3 customers after us being their first customer. And so you can imagine the kind of trust and loyalty that engenders. Also, our knowledge and experience that we can convey and help folks as they're learning, what we need and how to solve our problems. And then also, I've been a reference for our partners in terms of investors. I've spoken to a number of investors on their behalf to help them to establish, financing. And so, there's a mutuality here that we can both really exploit in a very positive way, helping each other to build these products, to build these solutions, and then create a partnership that it lasts a long time and has tremendous yields tremendous returns on in the long term. Chris, do you have any input on this?
Yes, certainly. If you think about AI startups, I absolutely agree that that data is crucial for them, and this is what the incumbent insurers, whatever type of insurance company you are, generally have in abundance. And this is why you can't consider AI technology in isolation. You must view it and think about how it relates to big data. That's data at scale and also at granularity. And also think about how the new AI technology from the startup or developed in-house will fit into your existing digital ecosystem. AI systems are not standalone systems. They must fit into your existing IT infrastructure and business processes, whether that's about acquiring a new customer, building a better customer experience, developing better analytics about predictions of accidents, when someone's going to fall, when someone's going to crash their car, or whether it's about really fundamental product innovation, like, for example, in health informatics or telematics in car insurance. And I think in terms of the implementation, I think it's very important to think about what kind of benefits you hope to achieve with AI systems? Is it, for example, very simple administrative savings? So if you're implementing technology to simply automate a workflow, that's very straightforward to evaluate. It's also relatively straightforward to figure out whether the technology is working. And in order to do that, you have to run experiments. You have to trial it and evaluate it. And I think it's really dangerous here if companies take a standoffish approach to AI. It really is necessary to embrace that partnership and also have the requisite experience, both the technology experience and the business experience, to know how and when to adopt it. I think if you look at the leading companies, like, for example, WeSure in China, I think they're also thinking about re-engineering in parallel with the implementation of AI technology. And I think that's also something very important. So, for example, if you think about the customer experience in an adjacent industry, companies like Monzo and Atom have been very successful. And you could argue that one of the principal reasons behind that success was customer experience. WeSure, part of the Tencent Chinese e-commerce company, has similarly focused on this in its insurance offerings, making sure that the products are very, very simple, and they use AI and digital technologies to make the sign-on process very simple and very straightforward.
Yeah, so that was, again, very fascinating. Thank you both so much. So there are a lot of, I think you've spoken a little bit about it throughout the questions, but I think there are a lot of untapped benefits for risk managers and the captive industry when it comes to data. So Julie, what are some of the benefits you've kind of discovered, and what do you think are some of the benefits that the industry can kind of take hold of that maybe they don't realize when it comes to data specifically?
Sure. So in terms of data, we, in the beginning of our engagements, we of course shared our data. And so it was important for us to get our partners to analyze that data, because that type of data analysis was something that was, extremely expensive, but we knew it had value. So even if these engagements didn't go anywhere, we at least would have that data analysis, and that was something that we would get out of the partnership regardless. And in each case, that analysis brought us a very clear picture of where our risk lies in the industry, and it enabled us to direct risk management programs and tools and create a tailored toolbox to serve our member insureds. So that was really important, and that was something that we were able to get immediately from the engagement. So that was a tremendous benefit. But also, what we're seeing now through these engagements and being a participant in creating the solutions is that we're understanding our data at a much more granular level, really where our biggest risks lie and how to approach them, really from a totally different angle. So I'll give you an example with regard to our engagement with AI insurance. Adverse development is, the bane of our existence as an insurance company, right? It's a problem for us. It's a problem for our regulators and our rating agencies. And so knowing where we are in terms of our reserves, and knowing early and knowing with accuracy where we are is a really key component for us. And I didn't know that was possible. But one of the goals of AI insurance, in addition to building us a gorgeous claims management system to operate within, is that as the data accrues and they get more and more data, they are using artificial intelligence to create a early predictive analysis for our reserves. So that is obviously the panacea that would elevates them, in terms of other claims management systems, and gives us something that we didn't realize that we could have. Another example is with our partner Care Validate that I described to you. That platform actually has expanded to focus on caregivers as well. So caregivers and the retention of caregivers and the education engagement of caregivers in the long-term care industry is a huge problem. It's something that we face due to economics and obviously the difficulty of the job. But that platform actually engenders caregiver engagement, responsiveness, loyalty, and satisfaction because it's developed a reward system that addresses things like remuneration, as well as education, pushing small education platforms to the caregivers. So it's a huge benefit to our insured's operations, and then ultimately reducing claims. So these are the kind of things that we've discovered that the data can really help us to serve on a very deep level our insureds, and then ultimately reduce the claims frequency and severity for the program. Chris, do you have any thoughts on this?
Yeah, absolutely. If you look at risk modeling, this is obviously something that's right at the heart of insurance, because it's about predicting both the probability of events and also their magnitude. And I think that AI as a technique for exploiting data is really almost unparalleled, really, in this regard. And this is why it's so important. I think the challenge, though, is to think about new possibilities. In other words, not just to use historical data. So if you look on the slide now, if we can just go down to the next model, please, on the diagram. What this shows here is changes in business models. Thank you. Now, the point about this slide is if you look at the top right-hand quadrant, what I'm arguing there is that business model change is very often accompanied by the novel use of new types of big data. So if you look at, for example, Manulife in the US, they've been very instrumental, a very good example here of using a new form of data, health behavioral data, and then completely redesigning their policies around that new form of big data. And I think this is a transformation from how they conducted business in the past. And I think there's a trap here for incumbent companies to focus on historical data, which of course may have some value, but they should also think about new forms of big data and also third-party data that may allow them to do things differently rather than making their existing business models go better, faster, or cheaper. And I think we can also see this with Ping An in China, where again, instead of saying, let's look at our existing business model and think about ways of improving it, for example, in the bottom left-hand side there, making incremental changes, or using some new data and then adding that onto our existing processes, they're always asking the question, what could insurance look like? And I think this is really important, to take AI technology and ask the question, what could our business model look like? That may be a result of several changes to individual processes, or it could be something quite radical and say we can use AI technology in a way that we haven't even thought about yet. And so I think that's really important to sort of step back and say, how can we innovate the business model in parallel with the implementation of AI technology? Thank you.
Thanks so much, Chris. That's really, really interesting. So I think we have a couple of minutes now, so we can go through some questions. And I think that we've got a couple that have come through on Slido. So I'll just pop that up and we can go through what we've got there. So we've got one here that's come through about AI. So maybe if you want to start this, Chris. So it says, what about expert systems? Are they really artificial intelligence, or are they just complicated rule-based systems? Do you want to handle that one, Chris?
Sure. This is a really good question. If you think about expert systems, they've been around since the 1980s, and that's exactly what they are. They're complex rule-based systems. So according to my definition, they're not artificial intelligence because they don't adapt in the light of new data. They are relatively fixed algorithms. And there's a really important point here that no matter how complicated you make those algorithms, it will never achieve some kind of real intelligence, but they can be very powerful. So if you think about expert systems, for example, in environments that are very much rule-based, for example, regulatory rules, expert systems can be hugely powerful. Most people would categorize them within the broad remit of artificial intelligence. My view is I think that there has been a step change from expert systems into artificial intelligence, where the algorithms change on the fly, so to speak, in response to new information. So I think there is a distinction there.
And so we've got another one here, which maybe Julie might be able to give some information on. So it says, hi everyone, talking about due diligence. How often does the info from rating firms like S&P are used?
Lauren, I can tell you from my perspective that didn't come into play, so I can't really speak to that in terms of other engagements. But you know, in terms of I just don't think with tech startups you're going to have those kind of metrics, that they're just not going to be available. So you have to do some of the things I talked about, which is a little more of your own research and kind of set up things that you think lead more to a likelihood of success. And that might be also talking to other people in the industry that can give you other benchmarks to look for.
Yeah. We've got some interesting questions about AI coming in. So we've got another one that says, some writers have talked about singularity where AI is more intelligent than humans. Is this realistic? So I'll get you to start, Chris. Is AI more intelligent than humans?
Absolutely not. My position on this is that from a managerial perspective, managers should be thinking about the next 5 years. From a philosophical perspective, it's a good question to ask. It's called the singularity, which is the point at which a machine becomes more intelligent than humans, and that can therefore replicate itself and potentially build even more important and more intelligent machines. My own view is that this is at the moment in the very much the realm of science fiction, and insurance companies really don't have the budgets to play around in. I think it's an R&D or even a philosophical question, and really the focus should not be on thinking machines, but on understanding the current technologies and understanding how to adopt and implement them.
Well, we do have a couple more questions there, but unfortunately we have run over, so we are going to have to leave it there for now. So I really want to thank Chris and Julie for being part of a very fascinating panel on data and AI. And I hope everyone has learnt something. So I just want to thank everyone for tuning in, and just a reminder that next Tuesday we have our next virtual symposium, which is on captive control. So we have one the following Tuesday on employee benefits, And then we have one on the 30th on captivating COVID. So I hope you can all tune into that. And if you go to the website, you can also re-watch any of the previous symposiums we've done. So thank you so much and have a great day.
Lauren, thank you so much. And just a brief reminder, if anyone wants to look at the short article on business model innovation and artificial intelligence, it can be found easily at Willis Towers Watson Research Insights.
Great. Thank you so much, Chris. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Julie. Goodbye.